Imagine for a moment being a 12-year-old child. Your world, though full of struggles, still carries that innocent glow of believing tomorrow could be better. Now imagine that on an ordinary day, this little world is shattered. You are sold by your own parents, not to someone familiar, but to a complete stranger, a much older man. What follows is an abyss of pain, fear, and silence. This isn't a fictional story. It's a reality lived by many a pain I carried, and one I now have the courage to share with you. Because sometimes it's only by telling the truth that we can lighten the weight of what we've endured. I know it's hard to hear this. Maybe your heart feels heavy, and you wonder how someone could survive something so cruel. I've asked myself that many times too. But you know what? The strength we didn't even know we had shows up in our darkest moments. And that's what I want to talk about today, a journey through pain, but also one of survival and healing. Stay with me. This story isn't just mine. It's a fight many others face in silence. And maybe, by listening to it, you'll see something you've never noticed before, the importance of not giving up, even when the world seems to be falling apart. Are you ready to walk this path with me? I was just 12 years old, but life had already taught me many lessons. I grew up in a simple house, with walls that always seemed on the verge of collapse and a roof that creaked in the wind. Our life was marked by daily struggles, a constant lack of money, and endless worry about tomorrow. I didn't know what it was like to have a new toy, or even clothes that hadn't been worn by someone else in my family before me. For us, each day was a battle to survive, to find food, and to have a place to sleep. We lived in a tiny house where I shared a room with my siblings. There were so many of us that we slept any way we could, piled on top of each other, just trying to find a comfortable spot. The noise was constant, filled with my siblings' chatter, the cries of the younger ones, and the complaints of the older ones. Each of us had our own way of coping, but deep down, we all knew the only thing we truly had was each other. My mom, a strong and determined woman, was always tired. She took care of all of us on her own, as my dad spent long days away trying to scrape together some money for the household. He worked as a construction worker, but the jobs were never enough to cover even the basics. Sometimes he'd bring home a little extra food, but that was rare. I remember the nights when we only had rice and beans, or just rice. My siblings and I got used to it without complaining, but hunger was always there, a quiet shadow in the background. Despite the hardships, my mum always tried to bring some warmth to our home. She taught us to value what we had, to be grateful for the little things. Her smile was my safe place, and her hugs were the only proof I had that there was still some kindness in the world. She used to say that family love was what mattered, that we'd get through anything as long as we stuck together. But no matter how hard she tried, the weight of life was overwhelming. And while she worked to keep us united, the burdens seemed to grow heavier every day. I was one of the youngest children, and because I was so small, my older siblings always tried to protect me. They shared what little they had with me, dividing even the tiniest scraps. But even with their help, I knew there was never enough to go around. I dreamed of one day leaving that house, living somewhere we didn't have to worry about food, where we could have something that lasted more than a single day. But those dreams felt as far away as the stars in the sky. I didn't know exactly what happiness meant, but I imagined it was something very different from what I saw every day. I didn't see joy on my parents' faces when they came home, or on my siblings' faces when they woke up. Everyone was just surviving, trying to get through each day, hoping tomorrow would be a little easier. I tried to smile, to stay optimistic, but the hardships seemed to crush any flicker of hope. And it was in this setting and upbringing marked by poverty and struggles that the unthinkable happened. I had no idea I was about to be ripped away from the only refuge I had me home, my family, the only life I'd ever known, and thrown into something far worse. The first time my parents mentioned the man who came to our house, I didn't really understand. They told me he was an important person, that he could help us, that maybe he could lift us out of the misery we were in. I didn't question it because I had never known anything different from struggle and scarcity. I just saw the look on my dad's face, and for the first time, he seemed at peace with a decision I couldn't grasp. Deep down, I wanted to believe him, to believe something good could come out of all this pain. But when that man walked into our house, I felt a knot in my stomach. He was much older than me, with a look in his eyes I couldn't understand. I didn't know what he wanted from me, or what my parents were truly planning. I looked at their faces, but I couldn't read them. The man's smile felt fake, as if he knew more than I did, as if he already knew I was just a child and that, somehow, my life was no longer mine. I felt a chill run through my body, but I tried to ignore it. I wanted to believe everything would be okay, that maybe he really was the solution to our struggles. But as I looked into his eyes, something told me I was about to lose everything I had ever known. And the scariest part? There was nothing I could do to stop it. My childhood, already so harsh, was slipping away, and there was no turning back. From that moment on, everything turned into something I couldn't comprehend. My childhood, already marked by hardship and scarcity, was abruptly ripped away in a way I could never have imagined. What I considered normal ceased to exist, and soon I found myself in a nightmare that seemed endless. The man showed up at our house with a proposal I didn't know how to interpret at the time. He didn't say much, but his presence carried something strange, a kind of authority that made me uncomfortable. I watched him from a distance, with the curious eyes of a girl who still believed the world could be kind. He spoke to my parents in a calm tone, as if he were offering simple advice. At first, I even thought he might be just another one of those people who passed through our lives, making promises that never materialized. But then, he said something or other. My father did that hit me like a punch to the stomach. "She's going with him," my father said, barely looking at me. My legs trembled. I didn't understand it right away, but the empty, emotionless look he gave me made me realize something was very wrong. It was as if I wasn't a child anymore, but an object, something that could be handed off. I tried to resist. I thought of my mother's words, her promises that everything would be okay, that no matter how hard life got, we would face it together. But in that moment, she seemed so distant, so absent. Her expression was no longer the same. She looked at me with an emptiness in her eyes, as if she were no longer capable of protecting me. Deep down, I knew she wasn't just accepting this. She was being forced into it somehow. The man stood there waiting, and all I felt was a profound fear, a sense that I was about to lose everything I had ever known. It wasn't just the walls of our house being taken from me. It was my sense of safety, trust, and love. I didn't know where I was going or what would happen to me, but one thing became painfully clear at that moment. I was being sold. Sold by the very parents I had believed would never hurt me. I thought about running, screaming, doing something to stop what was happening. But fear paralyzed me. In the end, silence was stronger than any words I could have spoken. They looked at me as if there was nothing more to say, as if there was no going back. The man took my hand and, without a shred of empathy, dragged me out of my home. The street was empty and silent, the sound of our footsteps echoing in my mind. I wanted to run back to my bed, to the only place that still felt safe, but there was no way. I was alone now, with no one to protect me. My parents had made their choice, and I, unknowingly, had become just a pawn in a cruel, merciless game. The feeling of being lost, directionless, consumed me as we walked through those unfamiliar streets. I could smell the dust, feel the sun's heat on my skin, but none of it seemed real. I was trapped in a nightmare, desperately trying to wake up. With every step I took, I moved further from the life I once knew, and I had no idea how to find my way back. I tried to talk to him, to ask where we were going, what he wanted from me, but he didn't respond. He just looked at me with cold, distant eyes. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't seem bothered by what was happening. He knew I was just a child, and perhaps that was what made him even more dangerous, the way he didn't see a life to be respected, but an object to be controlled however he wanted. With every step, I felt further and further away from who I used to be. I didn't know where I was headed or what awaited me. But one thing was certain. My childhood had been taken from me in that instant, and I was about to be thrown into a world of pain and suffering. I didn't yet know how far it would go or how long it would haunt me, but something inside me whispered that I needed to survive, to fight not just for myself, but for everyone else who had been torn from their lives in such a cruel, unjust way. The strongest pain I felt at that moment wasn't fear or the anguish of the unknown, but the overwhelming sense of guilt. I kept asking myself over and over what I had done wrong, how I could have possibly deserved this. I looked at the man who was always there, his cold demeanor unshaken, and wondered why he had chosen me, why I was the victim. He didn't force me to speak, but his silent presence made my mind race, searching for an explanation, anything that could help me make sense of what was happening. Each night felt like an eternity, and loneliness became my most constant companion. The small, lifeless room seemed to swallow all my thoughts and hopes. Every part of me was fading away, as if I were being erased, and I no longer knew who I was or who I could become after this. Sometimes I wondered if I could ever survive intact, if I could return to being the person I once was, but the answers never came. Fear mingled with doubt, and anguish consumed every part of my being. Outside, the world went on, I knew that. People still walked the streets, trees kept growing, and the seasons changed without me having control over anything. But inside me, everything was paralyzed. Time seemed frozen, as if my own body had become a prison. I didn't know if I was destroying myself from the inside, or if it was this place, the man himself, breaking something within me, a part of my soul that could never be restored. At times, when the man wasn't around, I felt an impulse to cry, to scream, to break the walls around me. But the guilt always came back, holding me down. How could I feel worthy of anything better when my own family had given me up like this, without a fight, without even trying to protect me? It felt as if there was something inherently wrong with me, as if being here was my fault, as if I had failed in some way. Loneliness became a constant shadow, and the absence of affection, of care, consumed me. There was no one to listen, no one to hug me and tell me I was wrong to feel all of this. Silence became a monster that devoured me, and even when the man spoke, his words held no warmth, no humanity. He was just a distant being, faceless, soulless. And I wondered if this was all I had now, the shadow of a cruel man and the pain of a stolen childhood. But within me, a small flame began to flicker. It wasn't a grand light, but it was enough to make me realize I didn't want to be consumed by that emptiness. I didn't want loneliness, guilt, and fear to define me forever. I knew the fight was far from over, but something in my heart told me I needed to find a way out. I needed to somehow reclaim the part of me that still believed in hope, that still believed there was a chance to be more than just a victim. I didn't know how I would do it, but I knew I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't live under the weight of this guilt and solitude forever. I didn't know when the next opportunity to escape would come, or if it ever would, but one thing was certain. I had to fight. Even if fear paralyzed me, even if pain crushed me, I had to find some strength within, a force greater than this place, greater than the cold, unyielding figure of the man who had imprisoned me. Every day, I asked myself what more could be taken from me. And yet, I felt a little stronger because I knew that, at the very least, my soul wasn't entirely lost. I still had something to fight for. I didn't know where this fight would lead me, but I knew I couldn't give up, not now, not ever. It was harder than I ever imagined. Each passing day in that place was a constant battle not to lose my identity. The man, that cold, detached figure, seemed in no rush, as if he knew I would eventually break, that he would win. But something inside me resisted. I didn't know where this strength came from, but it was there, persistent, even when I felt weak and helpless. I began to observe more, trying to understand patterns, the way he moved, what he wanted, how he thought. He didn't ask questions or force me to do anything directly. He simply watched, keeping me in a state of anticipation and uncertainty. Sometimes he would leave for hours, and I'd be alone in silence, wondering what to do. It was during these solitary moments that I started to recall the things my mother used to tell me, the words she always repeated when life seemed hard. Hope is the last thing to die. It was this hope that began to give me strength. I focused on a single thought, something to keep me sane. I couldn't let myself be destroyed. The overwhelming sense of isolation was still crushing, but somewhere deep inside, a spark of resistance ignited. I needed to fight, even if I didn't know how, even if I didn't feel capable of confronting that man directly. But the instinct to survive was there, and it was all I needed to start searching for a way out. I clung to every small detail I could control, the sound of the door when he opened it, the way his footsteps echoed in the house, the times he left and returned. Every little movement was a clue, a sign that perhaps there was a chance. When he was away, I tried to explore the place quietly, without making a sound or drawing attention. I knew any mistake could mean more suffering, but hope drove me forward. I looked at the windows, the doors, any possible escape route. That place was a prison, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. Each passing day, though filled with pain and fear, slowly built something inside me, the determination to reclaim my freedom, to become more than a victim of his cruelty. Each passing day I felt further away from who I used to be. The joyful and curious child, full of dreams and hope, seemed to have vanished. What remained was a version of myself scarred by pain, anguish, and a constant fight to not succumb. The reflection in the mirror no longer felt familiar. Who was this person with tired eyes and an empty expression? Where was the little girl who ran through the streets, played with her siblings, and believed the world was within her grasp? I tried to remember what my life had been like before all of this, afternoons with my family, the laughter, the simple moments of happiness. But the harder I tried to relive those memories, the further they seemed to drift away. The time I spent in that place, under that man's control, felt like it had erased everything. My memories grew hazy, as if my life before the abuse was part of a distant dream. Sometimes, when loneliness consumed me, I would close my eyes and try to imagine my life as it had been. It gave me a strange sense of comfort. I clung to those images, those fragments of the girl I used to be, trying to figure out how I could return to her, the person with a future. But over time, I realized those were just echoes of who I no longer was. I couldn't hold on to the past because it no longer existed. I was in a new place, a new reality, and my body and mind were being shaped by a cruel experience. With that came the constant question, who was I now? I no longer had a clear identity. I didn't know what to feel, what to think. The abuse had taken so much from me that there was no space left for my own emotions. I felt like a shadow, a reflection of who I once was. I didn't know if I was strong or weak, if I still had hope or if I should just give up. I was utterly lost, unsure of how to rebuild my identity. How could I go back to being who I was? How could I find the girl who believed in herself, who took pride in her humble beginnings, who dreamed of a better future? It was a slow and painful process, but little by little, I began to realize that despite everything, I was still alive. Even if I wasn't the same person, I still had the capacity to resist, to fight. And even though I didn't fully understand what was happening, there was something inside me that refused to disappear. I didn't know if I was reinventing myself or just trying to hold on to what was left of me. But somehow, the fight for my identity began to take shape. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew I couldn't remain lost. I needed something to anchor me, something that would make me feel like I was still a person worthy of love, respect, and a future. Rebuilding my identity wouldn't be simple or quick, but for the first time I began to understand that it wasn't about going back to who I was, but about finding a stronger version of myself. I didn't know how much that version could endure, or where it would take me, but I knew there was strength within me, strength that could help me reclaim my humanity and the part of me that the abuse tried to destroy. Day by day, step by step, I started to rebuild myself. It was as if I were unearthing pieces of myself buried under the pain and fear. It wasn't an easy reconstruction, and the pain never left me, but there was something powerful about it. I began to realize that by resisting, by not completely giving in to that place, I was, in fact, creating a new version of my self-aversion that wouldn't depend on anyone else's validation, but would rely solely on my own strength to keep going. The loneliness felt unbearable, but a small part of me began to rise and resist. Slowly, I started to understand that one of the most powerful ways to protect myself was to give voice to what was happening. At first, I couldn't even imagine how I could tell anyone. I was so consumed by my own fear that the thought of speaking felt like an impossible burden. But over time, I realized that my silence was killing me, in a way just as deep as any physical harm I had suffered. It was strange because deep down, I felt an urgency. Something inside me told me that to move forward I needed to tell someone, I needed to scream to the world, to someone about everything I was going through. But who would listen? How could anyone believe me? My parents had sold me. What could I expect from other people? That's when I started writing. I didn't know exactly why, but I had to. Even if it was just for myself, I needed to put into words what was inside me. I started writing on scraps of paper, on pieces of newspaper I found on the ground, even on the walls of the room when no one was around. It was a way to ease the pain, to externalize what I couldn't keep inside any longer. I wrote about everything I felt, everything he did to me, and slowly, this simple act of writing gave me something I didn't have: control. I felt that by putting my emotions into words, I was taking control of my own narrative, even if only for a moment. No matter how much the abuse tried to erase me, I could scream silently through the words. That feeling of having something that was mine, something no one could take away, was the first thing that gave me a sense of power over the situation. I began to realize that even without knowing how to escape physically, I still had something he couldn't control: my mind and my voice. When I wrote, the words seemed to fill the emptiness. I spent hours on this task, writing and rewriting, trying to organize the confused thoughts that had overtaken my mind. It wasn't just a way to escape, but also a way to understand what was happening, to make sense of it all. What I wrote wasn't just about the abuse, it was also about what I wanted for the future. Each sentence I wrote was a promise to myself that I still had the strength to fight, that my story wouldn't be one of a child who succumbed to violence and silence. This process of writing gave me something I didn't realize I still had, the feeling that I could at least control something in my life. Writing about the abuse, about the pain, didn't heal me, but it gave me an outlet, a small window to breathe. I felt that, at least there, on that piece of paper, or the wall marked with words, I was the owner of my story, and that was the first step toward reclaiming my voice. The power to name the pain was liberating, even if no one else knew about it. And when I felt like I couldn't take it anymore, I would write again. That's how I gradually learned that if I truly wanted to escape, I had to give form to all of it, had to find a way to communicate my pain. It couldn't be through screams or violence, but through words. I didn't know if anyone would ever read what I wrote, but the simple act of expressing what I felt, even if it was in the silence of the walls, gave me a sense of dignity. I felt less invisible, less powerless. I had something that was mine, something that defined me not as a victim, but as someone who had the right to express their pain and fight for their freedom. And even though true freedom was still far away, each word I wrote made me feel that, at least within myself, I was no longer an empty being, but someone with a story, a voice, a purpose. Words became my allies, my silent cry of resistance, the only way I could show the world I was still here. Each day felt like a shattered mirror, reflecting fragments of what my life used to be. I didn't know how much longer I could endure, as the weight of the abuse and oppression crushed me. But like any human being who refuses to give up, I began to search for a way out, a breach, a path to freedom. It was a distant dream, something that felt impossible, but the idea of escaping gave me a reason to keep going. I watched the man, his movements, his routines, trying to understand the patterns he followed. Sometimes he would leave for hours, and in those moments of solitude, my survival instincts would kick in. I knew that was my chance. I needed to be careful, silent. I couldn't make mistakes, but the thought of freedom, the possibility of living again, became an obsession. It was a silent battle between fear and hope. The problem was, I didn't know where I'd go. I had nowhere to run. There was no one around me. My parents had sold me, and my trust in anyone was destroyed. But the need to escape, to leave that nightmare behind, pushed me forward. I thought about places I could go, distant cities where no one would know me, where I could start over. But those were fleeting thoughts, because the reality of escaping was far more complex. Then I began to realize it wasn't just the physical environment keeping me trapped, it was my mind. The fear that he would find me, that I would be punished for trying to flee, haunted me. The pain he caused me sometimes paralyzed me, but other times it gave me the strength to resist. I knew that if I wanted to live, I first had to free myself within. I needed to believe that I could escape, that I deserved a life beyond those walls and that situation. Over time, I began devising strategies. I learned to move more silently, to calculate every step. When he left, I searched for every possible exit. The house was large, but full of doors and windows that, until then, had seemed impenetrable. I tried to memorize every detail of the place, every possible gap, every escape route. But the biggest barrier was still my own mind. The fear that he would return at any moment, the fear of being caught, made me hesitate. It felt like I was in a game where my life was the stake, and I didn't know if I would win or lose. Deep down, I knew I couldn't keep living like this, that I wouldn't be able to endure much longer. Each day dragged on like an eternity. Sometimes the silence was so dense I could hear my own heartbeat, and I wondered if I could survive another day, another cycle of abuse. But even so, my spirit wasn't completely broken. I felt that, even in the smallest actions, like taking a deep breath or trying to escape through the bedroom window, there was a growing strength. It was as if, despite all the terror and pain, something within me still believed that freedom was possible. Even if it was far away, even if it was just a distant dream, the idea of freedom remained my greatest motivation. And then, when I finally found a breacher window left open, leading to the world outside me, heart raced. I knew the moment to flee had arrived. It didn't matter how hard it would be or how scary the outside world seemed. I knew that if I didn't try now, I might never get another chance. Freedom was within my reach, and despite the fear, I knew it was time to act. My mind and body were ready, and I made the most important decision of my life. I would escape. I would take the risk. It was now or never. With one last look at the house that imprisoned me, I fled. I didn't know what awaited me, but I knew I had taken the most crucial step of all. I had begun my journey to freedom. Fleeing was just the first step. But leaving that place was only the start of a new struggling fight against the unknown, against loneliness, and most of all, against the fear that still followed me. I didn't know where to go or what to do. I was in an unfamiliar place, without documents, without money, and most importantly, without anyone to trust. The freedom I had longed for now felt like a heavy burden, an enormous responsibility I didn't know how to carry. I wandered the streets, feeling small and vulnerable. The world seemed vast and, at the same time, indifferent. I wondered what I would do now, how I would survive. Every step was uncertain, and I felt like a lost child in the middle of a giant city. The fear still lingered, now mixed with a sense of helplessness. The freedom I had fought so hard for now seemed like a trap, because I didn't know what to do with it. I looked for places to hide, drawn to empty streets and dark alleys, but the feeling of being alone and aimless didn't fade. The emptiness inside me seemed to grow daily. Even free from physical abuse, the emotional pain and trauma of everything I had endured was still present. I didn't know how to ask for help. didn't know who to trust, and the idea of going back was unthinkable. I had taken the step, and now there was no turning back. I knew that to move forward, I needed to rebuild myself somehow. But how do you do that when you don't know where to start? How do you fight for a new life when all you feel is the weight of the past? I was lost not just geographically, but internally. I felt immense anger at everything that had happened, but also deep sadness for who I had become. How could I regain trust in people? How could I trust myself? For days I merely survived eating the bare minimum, drinking water, sleeping when exhaustion overtook me. I couldn't think about the future, couldn't imagine a place where I might feel safe. The people around me seemed so distant, so different from me. I didn't want to ask for help, afraid of being judged or, worse, found. The fear that he might find me, that what I had done would be in vain, haunted me constantly. But then, something began to change. Amid that loneliness, I encountered small gestures of kindness, a smile here, a word of support there. I started to see that even though the world seemed cruel, it also had its beauty. I didn't yet know what to do with my pain, but I began to understand that to survive, I would have to accept the help others offered, even if it was hard to trust. I had to learn to rebuild my trust first in myself, then in the people around me. Gradually I began to rise. It wasn't an easy process, and with each step, the ghosts of the past still haunted me. But I started to see that I was no longer alone in the world, that there were people willing to help, and that despite all the suffering, there was still something within me that allowed me to trust again. It was a slow and painful process, but I began to understand that by opening myself to the world and letting others into my life, I was no longer surrendering to pain but choosing to live. The journey of rebuilding wouldn't be quick, and the road ahead would be long. But for the first time, I felt hope. The freedom I had so desperately sought now carried a new meaning. It wasn't just about escaping abuse, it was about having the chance to start over, to create a new identity, and to build a future where pain wasn't the only story I had to tell. At the beginning of my journey toward freedom, I had no idea where to start. The emotional scars ran so deep that reconnecting with the person I once was seemed impossible. How could I rebuild self-confidence when everything I'd been through told me otherwise? How could I look in the mirror and see more than the pain, shame, and fear that I carried within? The process felt endless, but I gradually understood that rebuilding wasn't something that would happen overnight. It was a daily effort, full of ups and downs, but one that, over time, began to bear fruit. The first thing I realized was that, to start trusting myself again, I needed to learn how to take care of myself, truly take care of myself. Before, my life had been marked by neglect, abuse, and the belief that I wasn't worthy of respect or kindness. I had to erase that idea from my mind. I started with simple gestures, taking care of my body, eating better, trying to get more sleep, and when possible taking deep breaths to remind myself that I was alive, that I deserved to be alive. It wasn't easy, especially because the reflection in the mirror didn't match the image of who I wanted to be. I didn't see a strong person. I saw someone fragile, worn down by pain. But slowly, I began to understand that my appearance didn't define my worth. What I saw in the mirror wasn't all of who I was, it was just part of my journey. My true value was inside me, in the way I started treating myself, in the courage to get up every day, even when giving up seemed easier. I came to understand that self-confidence wasn't something I'd simply get back, it was something I had to earn with every step, with every choice I made. When something small went right, like finding a safe place to sleep or having a decent meal, I allowed myself to feel proud. It was a victory, no matter how small. That pride gave me the strength to keep going. In the beginning, fear was still my constant companion. I felt like any mistake could make me lose everything again. But over time, I realized that real confidence comes from learning to fail and still moving forward. I had to give myself permission to make mistakes without judging myself harshly or demanding perfection. I was rebuilding my life, and that required patience and self-compassion. There were days when the pain of the past hit me even harder, when memories came flooding back and I felt weak again. But on those days I reminded myself, I survived. I am stronger than I thought. Even when doubt crept in, I began to understand that no matter how marked by tragedy my story was, it didn't define my worth. I still had a life ahead of me, and I deserved to live it fully. That's when I realized something powerful. Rebuilding confidence wasn't just about seeing myself differently. It was about learning to respect myself and giving myself the love and kindness I'd never received. I started to see that being strong didn't mean being perfect. It meant being honest with myself, accepting my flaws and recognizing the victories I'd achieved, no matter how small. Each little step was a victory. Every day I survived and stayed strong was a testament to my resilience. Now, when I look in the mirror, I don't just see pain and scars from the past. I see someone who still has so much to offer the world. I've learned that true confidence comes from within, from a place where I accept my story, my pain and my scars, while also allowing myself to grow and become more than anyone, including myself, ever thought I could be. I was rebuilding my confidence, and it was only the beginning of a journey that, while difficult, also brought hope and strength for what lay ahead. The freedom I had fought so hard for brought with it a new reality, the weight of stigma. As a young woman who had been sold by her own parents, the fear of being judged or stigmatized consumed me. The world outside seemed like it had no place for someone like me. How could I explain my story without being seen as a victim, as a broken person? How could I seek help without being labeled? I knew the road to healing would be long, but the shame of carrying that burden alone felt heavier than anything else. The first time I tried to talk about what I had been through was an experience that left a deep impression on me. I found myself in a support center for women and children who had suffered abuse, one of the few options I had for seeking help. The room was full of people, but I felt completely alone, as if everyone around me was in a place I could never reach. When it was my turn to speak, my voice failed. I didn't know where to start. The pain, shame, and fear were still so raw, and I didn't know how to share them without being seen in a way I didn't want. I sat in silence for a moment, the words stuck in my throat. Then, a woman who was there to support us looked at me with kindness and encouraged me to go on. "You're not alone," she said. "We believe you here." Those words were like a balm on a wound I hadn't realized was still so open. In that moment, something inside me began to shift. The feeling that I wasn't a lost cause was an immense relief. There, in that center, I found what I needed most: support and understanding without judgment. Still, the fight against stigma wasn't over. Many times, I still saw myself as different, as someone whose story was so cruel it seemed impossible to re-enter society. I hid, avoided sharing my story, afraid of being seen as a burden, as a reminder of the worst things that could happen to a person. Even with the support of those who understood me, the fear of being rejected by the world at large still lingered. But time taught me an important lesson. Stigma only has power if we let it define us. When I started to open my heart and accept the support of those around me, I realized I didn't have to carry the weight of silence any longer. The men and women I met, many with stories similar to mine, showed me that together we could break this cycle of silence. Mutual support, the simple act of sharing our stories without fear of judgment, became a crucial step in my healing journey. I began to see that even though stigma existed, it didn't have to be the label I carried forever. I could be more than my story of pain. I was someone who had survived, someone who had found the strength to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. Over time, I realized that true support was also within me. I needed to believe I deserved respect, that I was worth being heard and cared for. Slowly, I learned to accept myself, to respect myself, and to stop feeling ashamed of my story. I understood that staying silent was no longer an option. By telling my story, I not only helped myself, but also paved the way for others who, like me, were hiding in the shadows of fear and shame. Breaking the silence freed me and, helped others find their freedom too. Stigma can be a heavy burden, but the power of a united group of people willing to support one another can turn it into an opportunity for healing and rebirth. I realized I didn't have to carry the weight of stigma alone. By sharing, asking for help, and accepting support, I began to understand that I wasn't defined by my pain. I was someone who had survived, who had risen again. And by doing so, I started to rebuild not only my life, but also my place in the world. As the days went by, I began to grasp something that once felt impossible to understand. Pain, no matter how overwhelming, was teaching me to be stronger. The emotional and physical scars I carried marked me, but at the same time, something inside me refused to give up. The suffering I endured, the abuse and losses, couldn't be erased. But as I began to rebuild myself, I saw that this pain could become the foundation for something new, something powerful. I was taught throughout my life to hide my pain, to pretend everything was fine. But as I reflected on what I'd been through, something inside me began to shift. I no longer wanted to be a victim. I wanted to be a survivor, someone who, despite all odds, had found a way to keep going. This decision not to let abuse define me, not to let it be all I was the first step in discovering my true strength. The process wasn't easy. Every memory, every feeling of helplessness seemed like a reminder of all I had lost. But somehow, I started to understand that I didn't have to erase my pain to be strong. I could acknowledge it, accept its presence, but not let it rule my life. Pain might have been part of my past, but it didn't need to define my identity forever. I chose to look ahead and see what I could build from that pain. When I embraced my story, with all its complexities, I began to realize that no matter how terrible it was, I had survived something many might not. My pain, instead of destroying me, had made me stronger. I was no longer a victim, but someone who was actively rebuilding their life, someone learning to prioritize, protect, and love themselves. And that's when I found real strength within myself. I began to understand that although life's circumstances had been cruel, I still had the power to decide how I wanted to live moving forward. I learned to wake up every morning and remind myself that no matter how hard the day might be, I was winning. With every step, every new accomplishment, big or small, the pain seemed to transform into courage. I was building a new version of myself, someone who didn't just survive but began to thrive. I discovered that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the ability to move forward despite it. In every moment of doubt, in every painful memory, I reminded myself that the strength I sought was already within me. I just needed to access it and give myself permission to be strong. And little by little, I realized that this strength not only helped heal my wounds, but also allowed me to inspire and support others on their own healing journeys. I came to understand that by turning my pain into strength, I wasn't just healing myself, I was becoming an example that, regardless of the circumstances, we can reinvent ourselves. No matter what we've been through, there's always a way to find the inner strength to keep moving forward. And when we find that strength, we realize that our pain can become the key to becoming stronger, more empathetic, and more connected to our humanity. As hard as it is to imagine, this story is the reality for thousands of children around the world. And you, what would you do to change this story? Share your opinion in the comments and help give a voice to the voiceless. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and together we can build a fairer future for all children.